And as they say, greed ruins a fool. Once, a local oligarch in our small country was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Since our country isn't big, he didn't steal that much, at least not by Russian standards. The dramatic aspect of the event was that his son, as an accomplice, was also sentenced to 2 years. I knew that man quite well. When I saw him years later in social media clips, looking so pitiful after nearly 20 years of court battles, holding a bottle of water in his hand as he was led away under guard, I decided to speak once again about greed. About that toad that strangles so many active and capable people. Let's reflect on greed from a systemic point of view. When there were no refrigerators to store food for the future, no money or material wealth, there was no reason for greed. But when the first states arose, the greed of the rich and powerful blossomed in full glory. Few of them died natural deaths, most were killed by their own greedy relatives, hungry for their wealth and power. Not only did rulers rob their own citizens, often chaining them up, their greed also drove armies to plunder neighboring lands. The history of mankind is the history of almost unceasing wars. And people like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Vladimir the Saint, the Sun, Peter the Great, and others, they were not noble heroes, as history often paints them. From the facts we can see they were fratricides, rapists, and perverts. But above all, they desired to multiply their wealth, lands, slaves, and subjects. Artistic films usually fail to show the true motives, the greed that drove their actions. For example, films about the conquest of America often depict it as some sort of sacred mission. The music, the actors, all the best. Yet what these films truly glorify is the greed of European monarchs, who seized the sacred relics of the technically and socially less developed native peoples. Kings and princes hung these jewels on their wives and mistresses, hiding others in treasure chests. It's astonishing that just a few ships with a few hundred conquistadors managed to conquer entire empires in the Americas. Why? Because each of them, even the common soldiers, was consumed by greed and fought with enthusiasm. But greed is never satisfied, for it is an excessive desire. So monarchs kept launching new campaigns, to India, to the Holy Land during the Crusades, and elsewhere, all for the sake of trivial plunder and extermination of people and entire nations who dared resist. As a result, even today the Vatican and some monarchs remain among the richest entities on earth. Today, greed still rules the internal life of states that exist at various stages of capitalism. Greed also dominates international relations. There are still countries with feudal systems where the degree of greed allows monarchs to buy a single painting for $420 million. Such perverse behavior was made possible only because their nations happen to sit atop oil reserves. Greed shows itself in especially comical ways among those who have risen from rags to riches. A former Soviet man, having managed through deceit, bribery, or force to seize billions, now flaunts his wealth. Instead of redeeming his sins from the privatization era by creating new jobs, investing in automation, culture, medicine, and easing the lives of the poor, he buys football clubs, builds ever more luxurious yachts, and erects enormous villas. All this just to show the world what a supposedly smart and mighty billionaire he has become, at the expense of the poverty of those who drill wells in the freezing cold and lay pipelines. Outsmarting everyone. He should be ashamed. Psychologists can more precisely describe what complexes lie behind this behavior. But what culture or intellect can we speak of among those topping the Forbes list, if they engage in fierce battles for first place? Everything they do is for show, envy us for our exclusive shops, parties, and luxury designers. The hero of our time, a truly talented man, Elon Musk, once became $9.2 billion richer in a single day, a sum equal to the annual budget of my country. I wonder what truly drives his rapid enrichment, that same toad of greed for money, or a selfless mission to bring happiness to all the inhabitants of Earth with convenient internet from space, and to fertilize the Moon and Mars with life? If money is only a tool for achieving that, then Elon Musk is my hero too. Greed in our time still poses an enormous danger to life on Earth. Already in the last century, scientific and technological progress outpaced economic and political systems, as well as the average level of education, culture, and consciousness of humanity. At the beginning of that century, most countries were ruled by monarchs driven by a genetic greed and a desire to plunder neighbors and colonies. Yet the means of destruction, fueled by scientific discoveries, began to surge ahead. Tanks, submarines, giant cannons, and battleships appeared. Radio communication emerged. All this made it possible to kill people on a massive scale. By the end of the Second World War, when greedy monarchs had been replaced by greedy capitalists, they tried the most effective weapon, the atomic bomb. And they were terrified. But for how long? Now, the situation with greed is beginning to change for the better. It is gradually deflating. But there are still greedy bankers, and the owners of military, industrial complexes, MICs. The toad still drives them to buy governments, to secure orders for new aircraft, aircraft carriers, missiles, and nuclear weapons. Even though the weapons already in existence could destroy Earth many times over, new types are still being invented: biological, meteorological, psychological, space-based, informational, and who knows what else. The powerful of this world provoke coups and wars, because those bring new contracts for the military industry, contracts that their taxpayers, and the entire world, pay for at a colossal, multi-billion-dollar price. For instance, each nut used in a military aircraft costs 10 times more than one in a car. The profits are enormous and shrouded in secrecy. For some, war is grief; for others, it is a dear mother. How many more jewels can the wives and mistresses of the rich wear? And what meaning do billions on bank accounts have if they can't even be spent in a lifetime? Ordinary people cannot understand this. We and the rich have different problems. Some complain that their diamond earrings and necklaces are too small, others that their potatoes didn't grow this year. It seems almost comical to me, and I feel disappointed in people, when I see popular singers and actors flaunting their houses and the prices of their SUVs. That's not even the toad of greed showing. It's simply a lack of education and culture among otherwise talented people. But we pay them voluntarily for our own entertainment, so we can't accuse them of robbery or deceit. It's just sad to watch how, during the pandemic and widespread unemployment, many of them had to sell their apartments and their spotless luxury Jeeps. Who suffered more, the oligarch I mentioned earlier, when he sat in his prison cell, or the actress who wasn't greedy but merely imprudent, and had to sit behind a supermarket cash register? I always rejoice when I find stories about people rejecting the shameful feeling of greed. Even back in the Soviet times, I saw examples of how cultured people treated their wealth. Everyone knows that Sweden is one of the most prosperous countries in the world. I was lucky enough to work with Swedes building a woodworking factory. Once, on a train, I met some of the Swedish chief engineers I knew. One of them I didn't recognize. When he introduced himself, he said, "Stenlund." I said, "I know the Stenlund company, but what's your name?" The Swedes laughed and said, "That's the owner of the Stenlund company." For me, a Soviet man, it was a small shock, because in the factory workshop, I had seen machines bearing his name cast in steel. I noticed he was missing a finger phalanx. I thought, a carpenter, like my uncle, who lost his finger at a machine. During his entire time at the factory, he wore overalls and worked alongside the regular workers, setting up his own machines. It was fascinating to hear how he spoke with the workers, without arrogance, with humor, despite being a millionaire. That's what Swedish capitalists are like. The personality of IKEA's founder, Ingvar Kamprad, is surrounded by legend. Being one of the wealthiest people in the world, with enormous furniture production and retail networks, he always drove an old Volvo. Once, security guards at an international conference even refused to let him in because he had arrived on a public bus. Government ministers, Even speakers of parliaments, in Scandinavian countries often use public transport. They own no yachts or football clubs. As a cultured and intelligent entrepreneur, the owner of IKEA created a modern style of simple, functional, and affordable furniture for the middle class. It's more than just a style, it's a philosophy of life known in Sweden as lagom. Google it, and you'll see, in Sweden, flaunting wealth, driving expensive cars, or dressing like Kirkorov is considered both uncultured and unfashionable. Greed in Sweden has run out of breath. And not only in Sweden, but also in other highly developed countries. A nearly hour-long film by blogger Tushkin about Sweden shows this brilliantly and instructively. Another of my heroes is the former president of Uruguay, José Mujica. He earned his people's love through reforms that reduced social injustice. President Pepe, as he is affectionately called, belongs to the same generation and shares a similar fate with Nelson Mandela, Fidel Castro, and other Latin American revolutionaries. José also spent 14 years in prison. He was always a left-wing politician, and became known worldwide as the poorest president. He refused his presidential salary, donating it to education, and later, even declined his pension, saying that his wife's salary was enough for them. He lived to the age of 90 in a rural village, living off a modest garden. I once watched his meeting with AU president. I wondered what they could even talk about, the polished saxophonist and womanizer, now living richly off generous speaking fees, and this man who, after work, slipped on some worn-out sandals and went to tend his vegetable patch beside his humble home. They talked, while both were still presidents, a man of the past and a man of the future. Guess who was who? Look up information about the world's poorest president, listen to his speeches. His words make people start thinking correctly. You can also read about Henry Ford, who, though a billionaire, wore his father's coat and chose the cheapest hotel rooms. Maybe that was eccentricity? But now, more and more information appears about talented programmers and bloggers who made millions quickly, and then adopted that same lagom lifestyle. Many of them had first bought villas, cars, airplanes. One wrote, "Wealth began to weigh me down. I had to hire property managers, who robbed me. That stressed me even more. So I decided to sell everything. I bought a 2-room apartment in Bulgaria, got married, and now I feel free and happy. Nothing interferes with my creative work." Some of these programmers and bloggers live and work on small yachts. The internet allows them to work from anywhere and to travel the world for pleasure. They are not burdened by the care, protection, and accumulation of wealth. In the barrel of tar, that is greed, there is also a barrel, not a spoon, of honey. It's well known that the greed of rulers, their urge to suppress the poor and plunder neighbors near and far, led them to make spears longer and sharper, chariots faster, muskets more accurate, cannons with longer range, airplanes faster, and warships larger. But soon, steam engines, looms, trains, airplanes, radio, television, and other technologies, many of which were first created for military purposes, began to improve human life. You could earn the most from weapons production, of course. But one could also earn quite well by producing food, household appliances, and mass services. And here greed, or rather the competition of capitalists, began to work for the common good, because competition raises the quality of goods and the comfort of people's lives. However, greedy capitalists do not shy away from making enormous profits even from healthcare. The pandemic once again became a dear mother for them. Now they have engaged in information warfare with competitors to make as much profit as possible from humanity's shared suffering. Billions are at stake, and greed is on full display. In general, scientific and technological progress is driven not only by famous scientists, but also by greedy capitalists who fund science and profit from it. Let Bill Gates remain among the world's richest, but thanks to him, we have Microsoft on almost every computer. The internet itself, whose role in humanity's development is hard to overestimate, is also the product of greedy capitalists. And if greed had never entered human souls 5 or 6,000 years ago, we would probably still be living in caves, as we did for 50 million years after the appearance of Homo sapiens. Greed has caused immense suffering and countless victims among people. But because of it, within just a few millennia, we've broken free into space. The laws of nature switched on greed to accelerate our development, so that we might spread life more quickly to the cooling nearby and distant planets. Thus, nature forces us to realize its local, though temporary, solutions in the struggle against the inevitable heat death of the universe. But that is a topic for another discussion. Most likely, similar scenarios of greed are playing out in other parts of the universe, wherever conditions resemble those on Earth and life can arise. I'm not saying, bravo, greed. We must fight it, and understand its essence. And also understand that nature holds nothing personal against each individual tormented or killed by greed. The laws of nature are harsh, but they are just. It's encouraging that humanity now seems to be reaching a plateau of development, where greed is declining and new, intellectual motives for improving life are emerging.